That was a little bit better. At least that time you got the introduction done properly. So there'll be some editing I'll be having to do on the YouTube version. Meanwhile, I will say, as I was going to say a minute ago, please give us a like, a thumbs up, and subscribe to our Tubular Black Facts channel. If you could do that, please, that would be very much appreciated. And in the meanwhile, let us go ahead and read our proverb for the day, which is Mpanda ovyo, hula ovyo. Mpanda ovyo, hula ovyo. Which means if you spread your seeds out all over the place in a haphazard manner, you're going to have haphazard crops. So, as we say in German, you want alles in Ordnung. Alles in Ordnung. Everything in order. That'll be much better. All right. So, we got the proverb out the way, and we're moving on to our story for the month. Never Caught, the story of Ona Judge, a African woman enslaved by the Washingtons, Martha and George. So let's continue on with the story tonight. Okay, so we were talking about life on the Washington plantation at Mount Vernon. And one of the last thing, I'm going to read this last page over again just to make sure that we covered everything. It says that George Washington was immensely proud of his home and his lands. But if he hadn't owned humans and forced them to do what he wanted, he would not have been as wealthy. He owed his riches to the marginalized enslaved. Now, I'm not really sure what that's supposed to mean. Marginalized enslaved. I think if you are, you are, and if you're not, you're not. I don't know what the marginalized part is. Slave owners had the responsibility of building shelters for their slaves. At Mount Vernon, these quote-unquote homes, or huts, were spread throughout Georgia's lands. For slaves like Betty, who worked in the mansion, there was a 2-story building near the blacksmith's forge called the quarters, or the house for families. There, up to 67 slaves lived in one building, sleeping in wooden bunk beds on mattresses made of straw and covered with burlap. Children often slept on the floor. Slaves who worked in the fields of the different farms lived in shoddy 1- or 2-room log cabins. The major difference between the quarters and the log cabins was that the quarters was comparatively well made and had a fireplace to generate a little heat. The drawback to the quarters was that for the dozens of slaves who lived there, it was impossible to have any privacy. In the log cabins, you suffered through having thin walls that let rain and snow inside, but at least you didn't have to share your bedroom with 30 or 40 other people. George Washington and all other slave owners also had to feed and clothe their slaves. The enslaved who worked in the fields wore clothes made of shabby material. Slaves who worked in the mansion would have more clothing of a slightly better quality. Perhaps a patterned dress if you were female, or a colorful jacket if you were male, but only because George was so obsessive about appearance. Excavations at Mount Vernon near the slave quarters have shown a root cellar where slaves stored their vegetables after the harvest. They used utensils and dinnerware that were hand-me-downs from the Washingtons. Adult slaves received 1 pair of shoes. Children often went barefoot. When Ona was born, the value of Martha's estate, the property that she owned, would pass on to her grandchildren. That she owned and would pass on to her grandchildren would have increased. Every slave was considered property. Therefore, every enslaved baby was more property. and worth more money. George thought of himself as a benevolent slave owner. He often said he did not like separating slave families, and he believed that slaves who had grown older had to be taken care of by him. Still, he did separate slave families when he felt it was necessary, even selling slaves away from Mount Vernon altogether, and sometimes sending them to the brutal sugar and coffee plantations of the Caribbean. Despite sugar's sweet reputation, sugar plantations were quite literally the opposite, perhaps the most brutal of all the slave labor filled enterprises. Slaves who were sent to sugar plantations in the Caribbean died like flies, on an average of 7 years after their arrival. Like other plantation owners, George approved of whippings if he believed this dehumanizing punishment would compel a slave to get in line. This was the world Ona entered when she was born in 1773, approximately. Her owner was legally Martha Washington, but George, like most males at the time, was in charge of his wife's property. Ona lived in the quarters, probably wearing one shift or dress day after day, and slept on the floor. One of the older slave women would have watched her with the other children during the day when Betty worked. All the slaves, male or female, whether they worked inside the mansion or out in one of the fields, worked from sunup to sundown. If Ona got sick, she would not be able to curl up next to her mother for comfort. If she wanted to ask her mama a question or show her something new she had learned, she'd have to wait until it got dark. Probably even then, Ona would fall asleep before Betty came home. As Ona grew into a bushy-haired child with light skin and freckles, she, like all the other children, would have had no choice but to learn to fend for herself. Often, the children would be asked to do chores like gathering sticks for fires or fetching water for the mansion house. She may have had to work in the garden, helping to pull ripe vegetables from the ground, or she may have watched the spinners in the spinning house as they carefully threaded the flax strands over the big spinning wheels. For sure, Ona would have learned to steer clear of the overseers who were supervising the work of the slaves. She would have already received her first quote-unquote lessons about how to behave in front of her owners, and would have been advised by her mama about how she should stand and sit and speak and look down. One would not have to go to school, Ona would not have to go to school. There were no schools in Virginia anyway for young enslaved children. In fact, it was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read or write in the South. Martha believed that black people were morally and intellectually inferior to white folks. And while she sometimes formed close relationships with individual slaves, she never doubted the value of slavery as an institution that could preserve her way of life. But by the early 1770s, America was changing fast. Ona was going to spend her childhood with a front row seat to not only the literal battlegrounds of the Revolutionary War, but also to the battle of ideas sparked by the formation of a brand new country. Ona was barely a 1-year-old child when the First Continental Congress began in September of 1774. When George left Mount Vernon to attend this meeting in Philadelphia, he didn't know he was headed to an event that would set the stage for the two sides in the Revolutionary War. Martha didn't know that by the end of the upcoming war, her entire sense of the world as a place of slave owners and slaves, would be challenged. And Ona didn't know that she was going to have her own battle of ideas in her head, and that the outcome would surprise everyone, especially her. She's so surprised She surprised her own self. And that is the end of chapter 2. Okay, so tomorrow we're going to return and we'll read some more. But in the meantime, you know what I need all you little children out there to do? I need you to take your little head and put it on your little pillow, on your little bed, and close those yeah eyes, waiting on that big old sun to rise. And when you feel those sunbeams beaming down on your eyes, you know it's time to rise and shine, oh children of mine. Yes, Lord, it'll be time to rise and shine. So you just close your eyes for now and wait for it, because the sunrise will be here soon enough. And in the meanwhile, go ahead and get your rest. As for you adults out there, you know what you need to do. Go ahead and give us a like, give us a thumbs up, and then go ahead and recommend the Black Facts, the Tubular Black Facts channel to all your friends and your family. We'd really appreciate it, as you soon will see. And in the meantime, this is Doc Ock signing off. We'll be black tomorrow at noon and again at 9. And hopefully when we see you again, everything will be real fine. Peace out, y'all.